Welcome to the channel. Today's story is full of surprises and real drama. Subscribe and like to stay updated. Let's dive in. Sheriff Henry Blackwood of Lexfield, Tennessee stepped out of his patrol car. Fresh into his third term as sheriff, he adjusted his gun belt into place. At 42, he wasn't exactly a slim southern sheriff, but he wasn't far from it. Standing 5'11" in cowboy boots, weighing a bit over 215 pounds, his face was flushed, especially his nose, from too much time outside and maybe too much bourbon. It was early evening, with the sun just slipping behind Ironwood Hills. The air was cold, and the night would be pitch dark without a hint of moonlight. His breath fogged up in the chill as he closed the car door softly. The small house stood at the start of a hollow leading to the farm's fields. It was late autumn, so most trees were bare, though a few pines lined the path to the fields. Large oak and hickory trees around the house looked like towering skeletons, swaying in the cold wind that set them moving. Miller went up the 3 steps onto the porch that stretched across the front of a log cabin. He drew his Colt .45 in one hand and held a set of cuffs in the other. Frank used the gun's handle to knock on the door. "Collins, come out," Frank ordered. "Keep your hands free and where I can see them." Slowly, the door opened and Oscar Bennett stepped out onto the porch. Gary was a young-looking 36, tall and trim at 190 pounds. With his dark hair, blue eyes, and a square chin, most single women in town, and some married ones considered him to be ruggedly handsome. "What's with the Collins stuff, Frank?" Gary asked in a puzzled voice. "We've been best friends since we were high school freshmen. You've never called me by my last name." Looking down, he saw the Colt in Frank's hand. "Why the gun?" Now his tone was a cross between puzzlement and anger. Sheriff Blackwood pointed the gun at Gary. "Don't give me any trouble and put your hands out in front of you. Our friendship won't stop me from shooting you if you try anything." Gary looked at the Colt, then at Frank's eyes, and put out his hands. Frank tossed the restraints to Gary. "Put those on, and then we'll talk." Not having a choice, Gary put one cuff around his left wrist and the other one around his right. He locked them up. "Now, where were you last night, Gary?" "Right here all night." "You alone?" Gary hesitated for just a second. "Yep, I worked on the corral until dusk, cooked supper, and went to bed around 8, I reckon." He had not been alone, but he couldn't tell Frank that. Gary and Frank's wife, Alice, had spent most of the night together, and it wasn't the first time. Gary and Alice had been high school sweethearts. They planned on getting married when they graduated and Gary got a job. Lexfield was a small town and there weren't many jobs available, so Gary enlisted in the army to get a stake put together so he and Alice could marry. He also hoped to learn a skill that would make finding a job a bit easier. 2 events happened while he was in the army that would lead to the secret meetings between the young lovers. Gary's parents died during his 3rd year in the army. He came home for the funeral and found his folks had left him their farm and cabin. Gary had 1 more year in his enlistment before he could come home and run the farm. The other event affected Alice the most but also broke Gary's heart. Her parents hit hard times and they were about to lose their business and their home. Henry Blackwood told Alice if she would marry him, he would pay off her parents' home and pay all the back bills from the business. Alice liked Frank, they'd gone to the same school, but she didn't love him. She loved Gary and was waiting on him to come home. Alice and her parents didn't have anywhere to go if they lost the house and business, and there was no chance of making a living in Lexfield, so Alice decided she had to take care of them and agreed to marry Frank. She had tears leaking from her eyes during the ceremony. "What's this about, Frank?" Gary asked. "Nick Rogers was killed in front of the town hall just after dark last night," Frank answered, "shot with a .357 caliber gun." "You own a Dan Wesson .357, don't you?" "Yes, I own a .357, but I didn't kill him, Frank. He ran bad moonshine, cheated at cards, and stole things when he had the chance. It's no surprise he got shot. Got 2 witnesses at the scene who gave a description that sounds a lot like you. They said they saw a man running away from the body. Said the man was about 6 feet, slender, said they saw dark hair when the man's hat fell off when he started running." "Sure sounds like you, Gary." "Sounds like a lot of other men too, Frank." "How did those witnesses see the color of the murderer's hair?" "It was the dark of the moon. That big streetlight they put up on the town hall was burning bright. You know it's almost as bright as daytime. I didn't kill Dawson, Gary shook his head. Hell, I didn't like him, but I had no reason to shoot him. Where's your Dan Wesson, Gary? It's on the nightstand by the bed. Come on, I'll show you. Gary turned and started to go back into the house. Hold it right there, Gary, Miller ordered and cocked his pistol. I'll put you in the back of the patrol car, and then I'll go check on the gun. Holding on to his arm, Frank directed Gary toward the back door of the patrol car and opened it. Using a technique every cop has used to put someone into a car, Frank put his hand on the back of Gary's head to protect the suspect. Instead of protecting Gary, Frank used his leverage to ram Gary's head into the door frame. Watch your head, Gary. After he put his man into the car, Frank leaned over. I know you weren't alone last night, and I know who you were with. Now you're going to pay, Gary. You're going to pay big time. I know you didn't kill Jimmy. I did, and good riddance. But I am going to see you convicted of the murder and watch you hang, and then my cheating wife is going to pay. Yes, Alice is going to pay for fooling around on me her own self. Frank stood up, slammed the door, and walked into the house to retrieve the .357 pistol. Pulling on a thin pair of gloves, he came out onto the front porch and fired 2 shots into the ground in front of the cabin. Frank dropped the big pistol into an evidence bag and removed his gloves. I do believe this weapon's been fired recently, he said and laughed. Frank climbed into the driver's seat and turned halfway around. And the only fingerprints on the gun are yours, Gary. You fired that gun just now. Frank, Gary's jaws were clenched in anger. I'll tell them about that, you backstabbing bastard. They'll say I didn't, and they'll say you tried to hide the gun. Now, who are they going to believe, Gary? They going to believe an accused murderer or the fine upstanding county sheriff? After a short 15-minute drive, the patrol car pulled into the sheriff's reserved parking space at the courthouse. Lexfield was the county seat of Monroe County. The courthouse served both Monroe County and the locals of the small town. There was a lawn, benches, and a walking trail through the large courthouse square that surrounded the large quarried stone building. The building contained 2 courtrooms, county records from as far back as the late 1800s, as well as the town's records, the sheriff's office, and a jail with 2 cells. The jail usually held men who had overindulged in moonshine or whiskey, and once in a while, a husband in a domestic abuse case. Tonight, it would hold Oscar Bennett, an innocent man accused of murder. The next morning at 9, Gary was led into the main courtroom to be arraigned on the charge of murder in the 1st degree. Earl Stone, Frank's cousin, was the presiding judge. He was also the owner of the bank and the richest man in the county. Do you have an attorney, young man? Judge Stone asked. No, sir. I was brought here last night late, and this is the first time I've been out of my cell, Gary answered. Sheriff Blackwood, make sure this young man gets to use the phone so he can obtain legal counsel. Yes, sir, Your Honor. He'll do that first thing. Turning back to Gary, the judge continued, You have been charged with the premeditated murder of one James Dawson. How do you plead? We can go ahead, and if once you get representation you want to change or amend your plea, we will revisit the question. Gary couldn't believe how fast things were going. He looked at Henry Blackwood, who was grinning, and then at Judge Stone, who had a bit of a smirk on his face. Gary didn't know that the judge was aware and approved of what the sheriff was doing. Judge Stone held a grudge for a long time. Gary's parents had openly and loudly opposed Miller each time he ran in an election for the judgeship. They would bring to light some shady business dealings and moral issues. They never quite stopped Miller from being elected, but their efforts stopped his advance in the state legal system. Miller was relegated to being a small town and county judge, a small fish in an even smaller pond. The parents were long dead, but Gary would do for the judge's revenge. Not guilty, Judge, Gary proclaimed. I didn't kill Dawson and Frank knows it. We'll get into all that during the trial, young man. Turning to Frank, he said, Take him back to his cell and make sure he gets his phone call. Back in the cell area, the deputy sheriff, Jake, sat Gary down at a table with a phone and a phone book. Gary looked through the book and found only 2 attorneys in the area. One was the county prosecuting attorney, the other one was Sam Chilton, so he called Chilton. The lawyer agreed to meet with Gary the first thing the next morning. Chilton was sitting in a sort of conference room the next morning when Gary was led into the room in handcuffs and ankle shackles. He was cuffed to a round bar welded into the stationary table. After Gary was situated, Chilton looked at him. Mr. Collins, I should not have agreed to meet with you. I am involved in several other legal actions and would not have the time to properly represent you in a murder trial. Chilton stood up, gathered his briefcase, and spoke. I hope you do okay with your trial. Goodbye, Mr. Collins. He turned and left the conference room. What the hell, Gary thought, shaking his head. He was ready to defend me yesterday. Frank came in to take him back to his cell. I need to call a lawyer in Carlsbad, Gary said. Can you get me a phone book for there? Couldn't find an attorney here and thought I'd try the big city. Did you, Gary? Frank said. Carlsbad was about 80 miles east and a little south of Lexfield, with a population of just over 220,000. He grabbed Gary's arm. You had the one phone call you're allowed. Let's get you back to your cell. Don't worry, you ain't going to be there long. As Frank pushed his prisoner back into the cell, he leaned in and whispered, I told you I am going to watch you hang. The sheriff locked the cell door and left. The next time Gary was taken out of his cell was for his appearance in court. Frank escorted him down the hallway to the courtroom. Gary shuffled along. He was handcuffed with shackles on his feet, and he could only take very small steps. Just before opening the door, Frank moved closer to Gary and whispered, If you mention anything about Alice, they'll kill her. Do you understand? They'll take her over behind Silver Ridge, put a bullet in her head, bury her, and not lose a minute's sleep about it. Frank moved away and added, I am as serious as a heart attack, Gary. Frank sat him down at a table in front of the judge's bench and took off the handcuffs, but the leg shackles stayed on, and he stood close to Gary. Judge Stone straightened a few papers and then banged his gavel. Monroe County, State of Tennessee versus Oscar Bennett on the charge of murder in the first degree is called to order. Turning to Charles Norton, the county attorney and prosecutor, Miller asked, Are you ready to proceed, Mr. Norton? Yes, Your Honor, Norton answered as he stood up. Do you have counsel, Mr. Collins? The judge asked. No, sir. The only other lawyer in town said he wouldn't take my case. I wanted to call a lawyer in Carlsbad, but Frank wouldn't let me. Said I'd already had my phone call. So, you will be defending yourself then, the judge said. Looking back at Norton, he ordered, Make your opening statement, Charlie. Sure thing, Tom. He turned to the 6 people chosen for the jury and started to speak. I object, Judge, Gary said and tried to stand up. Frank pushed him back down. What is your objection, Mr. Collins? I don't know much about the law, but I do know I have the right to help choose the jury. It was only yesterday that I was arrested, and I've never met these people. Objection overruled. Continue, Charlie. Gary shook off Frank's hand and stood up. Your Honor, you're denying me my rights, and this isn't what they call due process. I want. Sit down, Mr. Collins. The judge instructed, and Frank pushed Gary back down in the chair. You'll decide what due process in my court is. If you continue with these interruptions, I will have you muzzled. For the first time, Gary knew and understood that he was going to die. Damn sure I am not going to get a fair trial in this county, Gary thought. Blood is thicker than the truth. The judge is Frank's cousin, and he's going to help Frank kill me. Don't help none that my parents always worked against him at election time. He's going to find me guilty and let Frank hang me. Don't matter much what I say. Norton stood before the jury of 5 men and 1 woman. His opening statement was brief. Ladies and gentlemen, the state will prove that man, he pointed at Gary, shot and killed one James Dawson with malice aforethought. The attorney put his hand inside his coat, took hold of his vest, and took a stance as if he were a modern-day Clarence Darrow. The defendant had a run-in with Dawson 3 weeks previously concerning a hog that Dawson supposedly stole from the Collins farm. The murder of James Dawson was the defendant's answer to that confrontation. Norton paused to let his words take effect and then continued. The state has witnesses that saw Mr. Collins shoot Mr. Dawson and run from the scene of the murder. We will prove that the defendant had the motive, means, and opportunity to commit this heinous crime. We will be asking for the death penalty. Norton sat down. Mr. Collins, you may give your opening statement now, Judge Stone said. Gary stood in front of the jury just as Norton had done. I didn't kill Dawson, and I was at home when they said it happened. Yeah, I didn't like him, and he did steal a hog from the farm, but when I confronted him about it, he offered to give it back or pay for it. I took the money, and that was the end of it. Frank or Sheriff Blackwood is trying to railroad me. He paused and then said, Guess that's about it. He sat down. Charlie, How long is your side going to take? I've got a meeting at 2, Judge Stone said. Not long, Judge. Got 2 eyewitnesses and a piece of evidence to submit, and that's about it. Present your evidence and testimony, Charlie. Norton took a sealed evidence bag out of his briefcase and turned to the court. Mr. Dawson was shot and killed with a .357 pistol. This pistol. It has been recently fired, and from the empty shells in the cylinder, it was fired twice, the same number of times that the victim was shot. This gun belongs to the defendant, Oscar Bennett. He handed the pistol to Judge Stone and said, I ask that this pistol be marked as Prosecution's Exhibit 1. Any objections, Mr. Collins? It's my gun, but Frank took it from my bedroom and fired it twice when he got outside. That doesn't prove that it killed Dawson. Objection overruled. Call your first witness, Charlie. The state calls Alan Cooper to the stand, Norton said in a loud voice. A man sitting in the courtroom stood and made his way to the stand. He was sworn in and took his seat in the witness chair. Sterling was dressed in a white short-sleeved shirt and bib overalls. His only concession to being in court was a very loud, very wide tie. It hung over the bib of the overalls and had to be from 2 or 3 decades previously. It also had food stains on it. Sterling had the shakes that accompanied withdrawal from a drug, in this case, alcohol. Sterling hung out at the Riverside Bar and Grill across the street from the town hall, and he was seldom sober. He would cage drinks from anyone who would listen to him. Sterling was surprised to see Gary in court. When Henry Blackwood gave him the money to testify, he was told he would not have to see the man he was accusing of murder. Mr. Sterling, you were in the Riverside Bar and Grill on the night in question, is that right? Sterling's yes answer led to the next question. And what, if anything, unusual did you see? Sterling had several beads of sweat on his forehead, and his hands trembled where he had them clasped on the edge of the witness box. Gary could see that he was coming down from his constant drunken state and was hurting. I seen a man shoot that Dawson fella. Then he stood over him and shot him again. And what time did this take place? Was about 10 p.m. I remember 'cause I just got my last beer of the night, and was going to head home after I drank it. Did you recognize the man that did the shooting? Yes, sir, it were him. Sterling pointed toward Gary sitting behind the defendant's table. Gary jumped to his feet and yelled, That's a lie. I was at home, and this old drunk can't see more than 12 feet when he's been drinking, and he drinks every night until the bar closes. Sit down, Mr. Collins, the judge said, you will get your chance to cross-examine the witness. It was dark that time of night, Norton said. How can you be so sure it was Mr. Collins? The shooting was under that new town hall light. Then the killer ran, but when he did, his hat fell off. That's when I knew it was him that done the shooting. Sterling pointed at Gary again. No further questions, Your Honor, Norton said. Your witness, Mr. Collins? When Gary looked puzzled, the judge added, You may cross-examine the witness. Gary stood, looked at the witness, and didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Sterling fidgeted in his seat and looked anywhere but at Gary. You're a liar. By 10, you're totally wasted and can barely see to walk. You couldn't have seen me. Objection, Your Honor, Norton said. Mr. Collins is badgering the witness. Is there a question from the defendant somewhere in there? Ask a question, Mr. Collins, or I'll excuse the witness. What's the use? Gary said and sat down. As Sterling left the stand, the judge told Norton to call his next witness. The state calls Peter Hayes. The only reason that Peter Hayes didn't hold the title of town drunk was that dubious honor belonged to Alan Cooper. But if the small town had been big enough for a second town drunk, it would have been Chilton. He had at least made an effort to clean up for court. Chilton wore a clean, if wrinkled, pair of slacks and a blue button-down shirt, but he didn't wear a tie. He too was suffering from the effects of coming down from a year-long drunk. Chilton was sweating as if had been working in the hot sun. His shirt was hanging on him and was wet in several places. His hands had a decided tremor and couldn't seem to stay still. He even staggered getting to the witness stand. Once there, he was all shakes and shudders and couldn't seem to sit still. Norton stood and began questioning his witness. The reason you are here, Mr. Chilton, is because of what you told Sheriff Blackwood about what you saw on the night in question. What did you see? Chilton wiped his hand over his face and sat up straighter. He too was nervous at seeing Gary in the courtroom. I seen Gary there shoot Nick Rogers twice and then run away. And there's no doubt in your mind that it was Oscar Bennett who shot Mr. Dawson? Norton asked. No, it were him all right. His hat fell off when he run. That's how I knew it was him. No more questions, Your Honor, Norton said and sat back down. Your witness, Mr. Collins, Judge Stone said. There was a bit of a smirk on his face and in his tone. Where were you when you saw me supposedly kill Dawson? Gary didn't bother to get up. I was in my car parked on the north side of the town hall square. Why were you parked there at that time of night? I stopped to have a drink before going home. Chilton gave a small smile as he turned toward the jury. The wife don't like me to drink at home. You do that a lot, don't you, Chilton? Chilton looked puzzled and didn't answer. I heard that every night you park there with never less than a 12-pack of beer and a bottle of whiskey. Chilton looked even more nervous and didn't answer. Gary gave Chilton a disgusted look and said, I got no more use for this drunk. Objection, Judge, Norton said in a loud voice as he stood up. Sustained. Mr. Collins, you will refrain from insulting the witness? It can't be an insult if it's the truth, Gary replied. This man shouldn't be allowed to walk, much less drive. Same goes for Sterling. Gary's tone was angry. If this wasn't a kangaroo court, I wouldn't have to do that. Judge Stone sort of swelled up and said, Mr. Collins, any more of that kind of talk and it'll hold you in contempt. You're right there, Judge. I got nothing but contempt for this trial. Besides, what are you going to do to me? Put me in jail? Gary slid down in the chair until his neck was on the back and his legs were stretched out under the table. Do your damnedest, he said to the judge. Judge Stone stared at Gary for over a minute. He was obviously angry at Gary's outburst. Finally, he asked, Any more on your side, Charlie? Norton shook his head. Then you can give your closing statement. Norton stood and stepped in front of the jury box. Ladies and gentlemen, the state has given evidence and proved that all of the factors necessary for this crime exist. Collins had the motivation, Dawson stole a hog from him. The defendant had the means, a .357 revolver, the same caliber weapon that killed Dawson, that the lab said had been fired recently, and he had the opportunity. He did the shooting late at night in a way he thought wouldn't be seen. He was wrong because the new night light at the town hall allowed our two witnesses to see him. I ask for a finding of guilty. Thank you. He nodded at the judge and sat down. Judge Stone looked at Gary. Your turn for your closing argument. This time Gary stood and faced the jury. You all know this is a setup. Those two witnesses haven't had a sober day in the last 5 years. Even if they could see past their drunk, they didn't see me. I was at home when Dawson was killed. Gary sat back down. The jury will retire, consider the evidence, and bring back a verdict, the judge ordered. The jury filed out. Gary watched them go. Every one of those jurors was handpicked by Frank and the judge. Won't be much of a surprise at the verdict, Gary thought. He was taken back to his cell, brought a bologna sandwich and weak coffee for lunch, and then was left alone until supper. Supper was another bologna sandwich, but this time it had a slice of cheese and mustard on it, but the coffee was from that morning. Damn, I am eating high on the hog tonight. At 7:30 the next morning, Gary was taken to the locker room that the sheriff and his deputy used. He was given a bar of soap, a disposable razor, a comb, and a towel. The deputy watched him the whole time as he bathed and shaved. You all worried I am going to cut my throat or slice my wrists with this cheap razor, deputy? Gary asked. Get done and get dressed. You're going to see the judge this morning. Gary was handcuffed with both wrist and ankle shackles again and led into the courtroom. Judge Stone sort of frowned at him and pointed to the defendant's table. The jury was seated in the jury box and some looked nervous. Do you have any evidence or witnesses to bring forth, Mr. Collins, before we hear the verdict? The judge asked. What good would it do? You're going to find me guilty when I am not. Guess Frank and you got it all figured out. Very well, Judge Stone replied. He turned toward the jury box. Mr. Foreman, do you have a verdict? If so, stand and read it to the court. A man stood. It was Luke Harris, the owner of the only grocery store in town. Judge Stone was a not-sausalent partner in the store. Holding up a piece of legalized paper, he read, In the case of the state versus Oscar Bennett on the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant. Mayfield paused and gulped before he continued, we find him guilty of the charge. He sat down quickly and wiped the sweat off his forehead. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Miller said. You are excused and may leave the courtroom. Will the defendant please rise? Gary looked at the judge, flipped him the bird, knowing anything he said would be useless, and remained seated. Very well, Mr. Collins. You have been found guilty of murder in the first degree by a jury of your peers. I sentence you to hang to pay for your crime. The sentence will be carried out after the state's attorney or one of his assistants comes here and reviews the case. Now Judge Stone gave Gary an evil grin. Don't worry, boy, it won't be more than a week. Gary was taken back to his cell and the restraints were removed. This time for lunch, the deputy brought him a large cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. Guess the condemned man gets better food, he thought as he was eating. He thought about the state's attorney coming to review the trial. Maybe you'll get to talk to him and tell him the truth. At 10 p.m., Gary had a visitor. It was Alice. She had been beaten. Her left eye was swollen almost shut, her bottom lip was split, and there were bruises on both of her arms. What happened, Alice? Gary asked. Frank did it. Said he wanted you to see part of what would happen to me if you say we were together that night. Oh, Gary, he said, had killed me? Alice had tears running down her face when she added, and Judge Stone told me if anything happened to Frank that he'd take care of me, and I believe him. They'll kill me, stash me somewhere, and bury me, but how can I? Keep quiet? Gary reached through the bars of his cell and pulled Alice as close as possible. He put his head against hers through the bars and ran his hands up and down her back as she cried. Swallowing hard, he stood back but continued to hold her hands. Don't worry, Alice. When that state's attorney gets here and reviews the trial, there's no way he'll let Frank and the judge hang me. I won't have to say nothing to him about us. Alice looked at Gary with hope. Your name will never come into it. Trust me, he'll always take care of and protect you. Well, I see the lovebirds are saying goodbye, Frank said as he came into the cell area. He came over and pulled Alice into his arms. Before they hang you, Gary, I want you to think about who is going to be sleeping and living with your little playmate. Just so we're clear, if you use her as an alibi, he'll kill her. He pulled Alice out of the cell ward and into the office. Gary lay on his bunk all night wondering if he was going to get through this trouble, or would he hang like Frank promised. Sometime just before dawn, he finally fell into a troubled sleep. His last thought was, he'll just have to hope the review of the case will at least get me another trial. Best I can hope for. The guilty verdict for Oscar Bennett was pronounced on a Thursday. The assistant state's attorney, Philip Davis, came on the following Monday to review the case. Using a small conference room, he took the next day to read the transcript, interview Judge Stone and Sheriff Henry Blackwood, and even had the two witnesses come in to talk to him. After his review, he found that in his opinion, everything was on the up and up, if a little unorthodox. He went to the judge's chambers. When will you have the sentence hearing? Judge Stone asked. We'll have the hearing tomorrow and carry out the sentence on Saturday. Got to have time to set up the gallows. I'd like to talk to Mr. Collins, if I may, Cartwright requested. That's a little unorthodox, isn't it, young man? Maybe so, but it is legal. I want to talk to Collins before you carry out the sentence. Cartwright was sure Collins was going to be executed. The whole trial pointed to it. Judge Stone stared at the attorney for almost a minute, trying to intimidate him. He saw a young man who was sure of himself, and wouldn't let himself be swayed. Very well, Mr. Cartwright, you can have time with the defendant after the sentence is passed. Gary was led into the courtroom on Wednesday morning. This time, Frank held on to his shirt and the back of his neck to make sure he remained standing as the judge walked to his seat behind the bench. Do you have anything to say, Mr. Collins, before I pass sentence? Knowing it wouldn't make any difference, Gary still had to try and get through to the jury, people in the courtroom, and the state's attorney. I didn't kill Dawson. Like I said before, he stole a hog from me, but then he made it good, so we were quits. Frank and the judge have it in for me. The witnesses are a couple of drunks, and I am sure Frank forced them to testify. They chose the jurors and didn't let me get my say. Don't let them kill me. I am innocent. He jerked away from Frank but remained standing. Gary was going to face his fate on his feet. Mr. Collins, you have been found guilty of the murder of James Dawson. You are sentenced to be hung by the neck until you are dead on Saturday next. May God have mercy on your soul. Sheriff, returned the prisoner to his cell. Gary was on his bunk leaning on the wall on Thursday evening when Cartwright was allowed to see him. Sheriff, I'd like to talk to Mr. Collins face to face. Please bring him out of the cell. I know you're some high up from the state capitol, but Collins is a convicted murderer and my prisoner. He ain't coming out of that cell cept in shackles, and you ain't going to be alone with him if he leaves that cell. Very well, open the door, and he'll go into the cell, and you can lock the door behind me. I told you, he is a murderer. Cartwright stepped in front of the sheriff and stared at him. If he kills me, then you can hang him twice. Now open the door. Frank wasn't used to people confronting him but opened the cell door. After Cartwright entered, Frank locked the door and stood outside watching Cartwright and Gary. Cartwright waved him away, and Frank left the cell area. My name is Philip Davis, Mr. Collins, he said and shook hands with Gary. I am the Assistant State's Attorney, and I have reviewed the trial. Gary nodded and just looked at the attorney. Is there anything you want to say about the trial and the way it was conducted? Mr. Cartwright, is it like I said before, I didn't kill Dawson. I was home when the shooting took place. Gary sort of laughed. This whole thing is a setup. How so, Mr. Collins? There are only 2 lawyers in town, and one is the prosecutor, so I called the other one. At first, he said he'd take my case. The next day, he said he had too much going on to help me. I think Frank or Sheriff Blackwood or the judge got to him and called him off. They wouldn't let me call a lawyer in Carlsbad, said I'd already had my phone call. Gary paced a little and continued, I didn't get to see the jury until the trial started. Ain't I supposed to meet them before? The 2 witnesses are drunks, and the trial is the first time they've been sober in years. The brief of the trial said you didn't want to question the jurors and refused legal counsel. Not a damn word of truth to that. The Millers are railroading me. Why would they do that? I done something that Frank didn't like, and my folks strongly opposed the judge in every election. Between Frank and the judge, they're going to hang me. What could you have done that would make the sheriff want to execute you? Gary shook his head and finally said, I can't tell you that, Mr. Cartwright. If I do, someone I care about will be hurt. Cartwright tried to get Gary to explain, but the young man refused to say any more. If you don't tell me more, I can't stop this, Mr. Collins. For your sake, you better tell me what's going on. Can't. I just can't. Gary had a hangdog expression, and his voice sounded defeated. Cartwright waited for a few minutes, hoping Gary would change his mind. When he didn't, Cartwright called for the sheriff and left the cell. Frank waited until the attorney cleared the cell area and looked in at Gary. That's good, Gary. Remember what will happen if you say anything. He turned and left the area. The gallows had been erected in the city square behind the courthouse. It was 12 feet tall with a square platform 12 by 12 feet. 2 opposing sides had a thick beam running vertically above the platform with a strong crossbeam joining them at their tops. There was a trap door in the center of the platform and a lever on one side that would spring the trap. Cartwright stayed in town until the day of the hanging. He watched Judge Stone lead the way up the stairs of the gallows, followed by Gary with his hands cuffed behind him. The deputy crowded the prisoner up the stairs and positioned him under the noose hanging down from the crossbeam. He put the noose around Gary's neck and stepped over to the release lever and put his hand on it. Judge Stone stood to one side of the platform. The state's attorney stepped closer to the gallows and looked up at Gary. Gary, what's your alibi? If you were somewhere else or have someone to verify your claim of being at your home, you don't have to die, he said in an almost pleading voice. Gary shook his head and looked around at the few people who had come to watch. Alice was standing in the back of the crowd, and Frank was next to her with his hand on her shoulder. Frank tightened his grip when he saw Gary looking at her and smirked. Alice had tears running down her face as she stared at Gary. He smiled at her and mouthed, I love you. Do you have any last words, Oscar Bennett, before we carry out your sentence? Judge Stone asked. He had a bit of a smirk on his face as well. I didn't kill Dawson, and you damn well know it. This is a frame-up. Gary looked back over the crowd and said, I'll be seeing you, Frank. He turned and added, you too, Judge. The judge frowned and then grinned, you'll be dead in a couple of minutes, boy. Nevertheless, I'll be seeing both of you. I'm done talking. Do your worst. Judge Stone motioned to the deputy, who pulled the lever. The trap door opened, and Gary fell through, snapping his neck when the rope pulled him up short. Gary felt the trap door open, felt the fall, and then felt the noose tighten around his neck. Then he was swinging back and forth. What's this? That didn't hurt at all. I can still see and hear what's going on. How's Alice? Frank held Alice up as she screamed and almost fell. Reckon that's done, Frank said. He pulled Alice forcibly along to his patrol car and left the courthouse square. Late that night, Alice was at her parents' home on her bed, crying. She kept playing over in her mind Gary smiling at her and telling her he loved her. Then she would see the trap door open and Gary fall with the rope around his neck. Every time she thought of Gary swinging under the gallows, she would start to cry again. The tension and stress of the day finally got to her, and she dropped off to sleep. Shortly afterward, a blue shimmering light appeared beside the bed. Its intensity ebbed and flowed from dim to very bright. In a few seconds, a figure could be seen in the light. As the light intensified, the figure solidified and stepped out of the light. The figure reached out and touched Alice on the shoulder. She slowly woke up and looked around for a second and then saw the figure. Gary, she said. Her tone was somewhere between scared and awe. You can't be here. You're dead. I saw you hang. She had gotten over her fear and was sitting up in bed. I must be dreaming. Does this feel like a dream? Gary, or his ghost, asked as he sat down on the bed next to Alice. He put his arm around her and pulled her to him. He gave her a gentle kiss and said, I told you I'd always take care of you, that I would always protect you. I came back to do that. The voice was deep and forceful. Don't worry, Alice. Everything will be all right. You'll be free shortly. The specter held her until she stopped shaking, then it kissed her again, smiled, stood, and walked through the wall of the house. Alice shook her head, thinking she had been dreaming, but could still feel the pressure of the kisses. For the first time in a month, she smiled. It was the morning after the hanging, and Judge Stone was on the 17th green lining up his putt. It wasn't a very long putt, just about 4 feet. His match with Judge Glenn Murray from another county was all even, and Wyatt had already made his putt for par. There was 1,400 riding on the outcome of Miller's shot. 2 putts for a tie, 1 to win and beat this old windbag, Miller thought. He made a practice swing and then made a shot. The ball rolled directly toward the hole, but about a foot away, it made a hard turn to the left. It didn't veer or trickle offline, it made a 90-degree turn and rolled about 3 feet away. Miller couldn't believe it. He knew he had made a good shot, and had never seen a golf ball make a turn like that. He stared at the ball for several seconds. Hell of a lot of English on that putt, Tom, Walker said as he tried to keep from laughing. Don't know as I would have played it that way. Lining up the comeback putt, Miller mumbled several obscenities. Well, I can still tie, he thought, won't win the money, but won't have to pay it out either. He made the short 3-foot putt, and once again, when the ball got to within a foot of the hole, it made a sharp turn, but this time to the right. It rolled about 7 feet and stopped. It sort of vibrated for a few seconds, and then the ball was still. The yelling and obscenities from Miller could be heard all the way into the clubhouse, which was 100 feet away. Several people stepped out of the bar to see what was causing so much noise. Walker tried not to laugh out loud, but this time he couldn't hold it in. Truth be told, he didn't like Miller much. He thought Miller was unprincipled, unethical, and was more concerned with how his office could make him rich and powerful instead of serving the law and the citizens of his county. Strange putting stroke, Miller. Walker had a wide grin on his face. That's 1,400 and lunch you owe me. Earl Stone almost screamed, and his face was a deep, unhealthy shade of red. He swung his putter at the ball, digging a groove in the green but knocking the ball into the greenside lake. Then he threw his putter after it. Miller glared at Wyatt as he stomped across the green to his golf cart. Reaching into his golf bag, he pulled out his wallet. He counted out 14 100 bills. He came back and handed Walker the 1,400 and then added a 60. Buy your own damned lunch, Miller said in a voice filled with anger. Miller climbed into the golf cart and stomped on the gas pedal. It didn't give him much satisfaction, as it was an electric cart and was very quiet. When he got to the parking lot, he threw his bag and clubs into the trunk of his car and drove off at a high rate of speed. Guess he didn't like losing, Wyatt said and chuckled. He walked 100 feet to the bar and restaurant, and went inside for lunch. At 11 p.m., Judge Earl Stone was feeling no pain. He wasn't really drunk, but was close to it, thanks to the 3 large glasses of bourbon. He stood to go to bed and knocked over his empty glass on the end table next to his sofa. As he bent over to pick it up, he felt like someone put their foot on his butt and pushed hard. Miller traveled about 3 feet before hitting the floor and slid for another 2 or 3 feet. The judge picked himself up, looked around, and didn't see the faint blue light in the corner. "Guess I am drunker than I thought," he said. "Better get myself to bed. Got to be up for court tomorrow." He climbed the stairs to his bedroom and took a quick shower. Dressing in his monogrammed pajamas, he climbed into bed and laid back. Hope the damn room doesn't start spinning. Got to get the air conditioning looked at, he thought as his bedroom had a definite chill. He pulled the quilt up over him. About an hour later, Miller awoke in a sweat. It was not very warm in the room. Whispering voices in his bedroom could be faintly heard. "I can't be hearing voices," he thought. "No, not voices, a voice. What the hell is that?" He heard another noise and sat up. Across the room, his golf bag was standing close to the wall, quivering. As he watched, his clubs, one at a time, levitated out of the bag, seemingly of their own accord. They flew at a high rate of speed and embedded themselves in the wall behind the bed. They missed Miller by no more than 2 feet. A shimmering blue light at the foot of the bed grew brighter and solidified into the figure of Oscar Bennett. Miller screamed like a little girl and opened the drawer in the nightstand. He grabbed his gun, a 9mm Glock 17, and shot until the slide locked open on the empty magazine. The bullets traveled through the figure and hit the wall behind it. "You can't be here!" Miller yelled and started to cry. "I hung you. I saw you die." "Yes, you did. Now it's your turn, Miller," Gary said. The wraith took a step closer to the bed and reached out with his hands toward Miller's chest. The hands passed through the old man into his chest, and the specter made a squeezing motion. The judge screamed, clutched his chest, and fell backward onto the bed. The wraith that was Oscar Bennett smiled and pulled its hands back. The figure slowly faded until just the blue light remained, then it disappeared. Frank stopped by Judge Miller's house mid-morning the next day. The judge had a court session scheduled for 9 a.m. that morning and hadn't shown up or called to reschedule. Several phone calls to his residence, and his cell phone had gone unanswered. Frank knocked, and then using a key given to him by the judge, opened the front door. The house was quiet, and there was no answer when Frank called for his cousin. Heading up the stairs, Frank shivered. "Damn, the old man must have the AC set really low," Frank said. He knocked on the closed door of the main bedroom. Not hearing an answer, he opened the door and entered the room, then he stopped dead. The judge was on his back in the middle of his bed. "Damn, rigor mortis has set in. He's as stiff as a board," Frank thought as he touched the body and felt how cold it was. One of the dead man's arms was extended into the air and out from its body, the other clutched his chest over his heart. Looks like he was trying to hold something away from him. "Guess I'd better call Doc Little." Dr. Clark Henry was one of 3 doctors in Monroe County, and since Lexfield was the county seat, he was also the medical examiner for the entire county. Had been the one to examine Dawson when he was killed. Doc Little examined Judge Stone in his bedroom. He made a preliminary cause of death as heart failure. Little based his findings on the clutching of the chest and the slight blue tone of the victim's lips and around his eyes. It was a surprise to Dr. Little. "I'll know more after the autopsy," Little told Frank. "What I don't understand is the golf club stuck in the wall, or the bullet holes in the wall." "Oh well, I'll let you know what I find, and listen, I am sorry for your loss." The next day, Doc Little called Frank. "Well, it was a heart attack all right. Don't understand it. I gave Tom an extensive physical 3 weeks ago. All tests and indications showed that. He had the physique of a man 20 years younger. No signs of possible heart problems. Just goes to show you, even healthy guys get heart problems," Frank offered. "The strange thing is that there was actual bruising on his heart," Little continued. "Looked like someone squeezed the heart very hard. Of course, that's impossible, and that doesn't explain the blue coloring around his eyes and his lips. Done my job, and that's the best I can give you, Frank. Have the county send my fee." Frank sat at his desk for several minutes thinking about the doc's report, the golf clubs in the wall, and the bullet holes. "Wish I knew what happened," he said. Then he sat up straight. "By God, I can." The old man put a security system with cameras in the house. Thought someone was stealing his booze. He stood and started toward his patrol car. Reckon I better get those recordings. The security system was better than older systems, but not as good as the new ones that uploaded data to the cloud. It didn't use tape, it recorded everything it saw and heard on DVDs. The info was kept a predetermined amount of time, and then if the disc wasn't replaced, it would erase it and use it for the next period. Frank inserted the DVD on the judge's computer, sat down, and pulled up the security feed for the night the judge died. What Frank saw was the judge sitting up and looking across the room. The image of the golf clubs flying across the room and embedding themselves in the wall made Frank stop. He replayed that part again. "What the hell?" Frank said. He saw the judge staring at the end of his bed, heard the judge's comments of "You can't be here. I hung you. I saw you die." Then the feed showed Judge Stone reach out with one hand as if protecting himself while the other clutched his chest. He fell back on the bed and was still. Frank shook his head and sat back in the chair. Who was he talking to? Frank thought, and what is with those golf clubs? Who was he trying to push away? Doesn't make any sense. Thinking another look would help, Frank replayed the footage, but nothing was different except as the video came to the end, 3 words appeared in large blood-red letters. The words "You're next." Frank pulsed from eerily bright to dim and back to bright, then they slowly faded. Frank pushed back in the office chair, and it rolled several feet from the computer desk. He sat there, not believing what had seen. As he watched, the 3 words appeared again for almost a minute and then faded away again. The room had become colder, and Frank shivered. He stood up, grabbed the DVD, and left the house, almost running to get away. The patrol car started ground but refused to start. The siren came on and ran up and down the scale, the red and blue lights flashed on and off in a random sequence, and the radio put out very loud static. Frank turned everything off, but they all came back on. Then the riot shotgun started to rattle back and forth in its holder. Frank jumped out of the car and started walking at a furious pace. He walked toward the courthouse square. After about 100 yards, he used his lapel mic to call the sheriff's office. When a deputy answered, Frank said, "Jake, my cruiser broke down in front of the judge's house. Get a tow truck and bring it back to the maintenance department." After a few seconds, he answered, "No, I don't want to wait for the tow. I am walking back." Jake and the patrol car arrived back at his office at about the same time. Jake had driven it back and got out as his boss walked up. "Nothing wrong with your car, Sheriff. As far as I can tell, started right up and drove fine." Jake handed Frank the keys to the patrol car. For the next hour or so, Frank sat at his desk and thought about the happenings of that morning. He gave Jake the security DVD. "Take a look at this and let me know what you think," he ordered. Jake took the disc to his computer station and inserted it. He sat down and waited for the DVD to play. After a few minutes, he took it out, reinserted it, and waited. Nothing happened. Jake pulled the disc and offered it back to Frank. "Hey, Sheriff, this disc is blank. What about the golf clubs?" Frank asked. "What about what the judge said? What about the words at the end? Didn't see any of that. You sure you gave me the right DVD?" Frank grabbed the disc and went back to his desk. He put the DVD in the player on his computer. In less than 3 seconds, the scene in the judge's bedroom appeared. Frank watched the images again. At the end, the same blood-colored words appeared, "You're next, Frank." He screamed in anger, ejected the disc, and broke it into several pieces. "I am going home," he told his deputy. "You got the duty." "But, Sheriff, it's my night off," Jake complained, but he was talking to Frank's back. Sheriff Blackwood didn't drink very much, but he made an exception when he got home. After 2 very large glasses of bourbon, his mind stopped spinning. Had been in an uproar since he'd seen the security footage. He took his .44 revolver and put it on his nightstand, then he dropped his belt and holster on the floor. Frank propped himself up against the headboard with a couple of pillows behind him. Alice was visiting her parents. She'd been there since Gary's execution. She was sure that Frank and the judge had framed Gary, and she wanted to leave not just her marriage, but the town as well. But Alice didn't have the courage to leave or file for a divorce. She wasn't sure how Frank would treat her parents if she tried to get a divorce or left town, so she would stay for now. "Damn woman's at her parents," Frank muttered. "It'll put a stop to that. She belongs home with me." Frank didn't really care that much about his wife, but he wanted her close where he could control her. Gonna make her life hell for cheating on me with that damn Collins. He took another long drink of bourbon, and just as he started to drop off to sleep, he got cold. Frank reached for the quilt on the bed, but it wouldn't move. He sat up to pull and free the cover but was distracted by a blue shimmering light at the foot of the bed. A figure began to materialize out of the light. Frank watched as the light solidified into Oscar Bennett. It seemed to be holding on to the quilt. "You're dead," Frank screamed. The Wraith Gary grinned at his victim. "I told you I'd see you again, Frank." The sheriff pawed at his pistol and finally picked it up. He fired at the figure until his weapon clicked on an empty chamber. The bullets had no effect. Frank saw his bullets pass through Gary and hit the wall behind him, blowing large holes in the sheetrock. Gary laughed and stepped to the side of the bed. "You can't hurt me. I am already dead, remember? Now you're going to pay for killing me. Now you're going to pay for hurting Alice. Now you're going to pay." He leaned over, took a pillow from behind Frank, and pushed him down flat on his back. Frank tried to push the figure away, but his arms went through it just as his bullets had. Gary put the pillow over his victim's face and pushed down hard. Frank struggled and pushed at the pillow. After 3 or so minutes, Frank stopped moving. "I hope you come to this afterlife, this whatever it is," Gary's wraith said to Frank's body. "You got off too easy. I want to torture you some more." The apparition slowly faded away. Late that same night, Alice was in a state between wakefulness and sleep. Gary's ghost visited her again. "You can stop being scared, Alice. Frank can't hurt you or your parents anymore." "What do you mean?" she asked. "I made sure he won't bother you again. Go on and enjoy your life. If you would, think of me now and then. Remember, I'll always be here to protect you." The ghost disappeared as Alice came fully awake. Frank's body was discovered the next afternoon by his deputy. Jake had come to check in with the sheriff when there was no answer to phone calls or radio calls. The deputy quickly called Dr. Little, the medical examiner. Little's investigation didn't reveal much more than the one for the judge. "Looks like Frank had his oxygen cut off by a pillow. Looks like he was smothered," Little said aloud in his morgue. He had developed the habit of talking to himself while doing autopsies. "Can't be. How do you smother yourself?" All signs show someone doing this to the sheriff, but there wasn't any evidence of a break-in. Anyway, Frank's pistol was beside the bed and empty, and there were all those holes in the wall. He was a good shot and would have hit an intruder. And Frank had the same blue tone around his eyes and lips as Judge Stone. A copy of Dr. Little's report went to the state, and another copy was filed at the county courthouse along with a death certificate. The report stated a heart attack as the cause of death. The manifestation of Oscar Bennett sort of sat on the hillside overlooking his grave. The cold wind that was blowing made the trees dance and sway. Alice, wearing a long black veil of mourning, was visiting Gary's gravesite. She came every 2 or 3 weeks to talk to Gary. Mostly she stood by the grave, but sometimes she put her hand on the headstone and told him about her life. The wraith would listen to her and feel a little peace. "She walks the hills and nobody knows, nobody sees, nobody knows but me," it said. And that's the eerie end of our story. Do you think justice was truly served, or could there be more secrets buried in Lexfield? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more haunting tales. See you next time.